Hey everybody, welcome to episode 111 of At Percussion. It's a beautiful Sunday afternoon, September 3rd. I'm Laura Black, sitting in for Casey Cangelosi today. Of all places, he has rehearsal, so he might be able to join us in just a little bit. But as always, I'm joined by the other regular co-hosts over in Missouri, Megan Arns.
Hello.
And down in Texas, Ben Charles.
Hi, everybody.
So, guys, we just finished up, well, for Ben and I and Casey, our first week. And, Megan, you just finished your second week of class. How's everybody doing?
A little fried. I think I got laryngitis from the first 2 weeks.
Yeah,
I'm a little hoarse.
I always forget how much I have to talk during the first week. And, I have, 4 or 5 freshmen, and I have to give the same lesson, 4 or 5 times. And by the fifth time explaining piston strokes in the week, I'm just shot.
Oh, I know. Or you say things 8 times. Guys, send me your rep list. And then you email them, send me your rep list. And then they show up for a lesson, and they have not sent a rep list. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So, guys, about our guest today, it's been really cool to watch his company grow over the years. So the three of us, when we were in undergrad, we would see these marimbas kind of here and there. But now they're really all over the world, and they're very commonly placed just about anywhere you can go.
The hall from me.
Or they're not across the hall. So we've had several of his company's artists/endorsees on the show already, such as Eric O'Dymo, Beverly Johnston, Matt Sherrick, and Mike Truesdale. And we're so stoked to have with us from beautiful Arcata, California, the founder and mastermind of Marimba One. Hello, and welcome to you, Ron Samuels.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're so happy that you were able to join us today. Just to get started, I know that I've heard you talk about what made you want to start building marimbas before, but I think a lot of people listening have maybe never heard that story. So if there's an abridged version you can give us of what made you want to build marimbas in the first place, we would love to hear it.
Sure. What attracted me to building marimbas was I had first heard Zimbabwean-style marimbas up in Eugene, Oregon, and I thought the sound was super cool, really great. And at the time I was playing a lot of piano, and I had the complete misconception that I could play on those marimbas what I like to play on the piano. So I came back to Humboldt University, and the Zimbabwean marimbas are diatonic instruments. And so I started taking from J.B. Smith on chromatic marimba, and quickly learned that there was no way I could transfer what I wanted to play on the marimba that I played on the piano. But I just fell in love with the sound of the marimba. And when summertime came around, after studying for about a year or so, I looked through the Steve Weiss catalog and found that I could not afford a marimba. And so I thought, well, maybe I could just go ahead and build one for myself. And that's what launched me on my marimba making career. The abridged version.
So, Ron, I have a question to follow up to that. What did your mother think when you decided to start making a marimba company, especially at a time when marimbas weren't so common?
Well, both my parents were really supportive of me. They did think it was a little bit of a crazy idea to do this, but they could tell I was really passionate and super into it. So they thought it was the right thing for me to be doing. They weren't sure until later on, as they started to become somewhat successful, that it was really going to, take off and something was going to happen. But they were, they were amused and supportive of me, I'd say.
And what were some of the early obstacles that you faced in starting this company?
Wow. Well, I would say the early obstacles were all trying to figure out how to build a marimba, and that's really what it was. And at the time, that's when I thought about starting a marimba company. It didn't occur to me till several years later, and that I could convert my hobby into actually making some money doing it. But the whole time, I was always trying to figure out how to build a marimba, and that was everything from the engineering of the frame to the engineering of the resonators and to have the bars on it, and just just that mechanical layout, have the bars line up correctly over the resonators was for me a really big challenge. And then all the tuning, and the tuning was really, really challenging for me. I had one hour tuning lesson from this old guy named Del Roper, who some of you may know is somewhat of a historical figure in the marimba scene. And Del Roper and his super talented friend named Lowell Montz, they built marimbas in the 50s. And it was sort of funny when I met those two old guys, which would have been in the mid 80s. They were sure that a big marimba company was going to come to them and offer them $1 million for all their secrets they had. But instead, I showed up. And I talked them into one hour tuning lesson, and that's really what got me going, setting my mind in the right place. So I started to know what to look for in tuning bars, and then also tuning resonators.
Speaking of tuning resonators and bars, Gordon Stout asked us through Facebook. He said, "Why do you not use round tubes on the bottom of your marimbas?"
Well, that is such an interesting question, and there's a lot of different opinions as marimba players know, and what I learned over time, after lots of experimentation, to make a big sound, to get like a big sound in a hall on a marimba, you have to physically move a lot of air, which comes down to the volume of the inside of the resonator. And so I figured that out. I learned that. And also, I wanted to make instruments that were really comfortable for people to play. And to me, I talked to a lot of people, and I decided upon what seems to me a really comfortable width and length of bars for people. And so one way to get like a really big volume, of moving airs to have really wide bars, is you could use a large diameter resonator. And what that means is it puts you in a position of having to maybe change how you play the marimba, because your reaches are so big with mallets. And so what I settled upon is I actually started the idea, and actually no one's really copied us on the oval resonators, is using what I felt was just a comfortable width of bar, and also that worked well acoustically within the proportions of the bar itself, and then progressively larger oval resonators. And so that's why I decided to do that, to keep it basically, in my mind, very player-oriented, just a comfortable spacing, and really let it be my responsibility to figure out and understand the acoustics of the resonators to make it work.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we've all played that marimba that has the super wide intervals and the low range, and it's pretty uncomfortable. So since we're talking about your resonators, particularly in the low end, I know that a few years ago, probably about 5 years ago at this point, actually, you released your Basso Bravo resonators, and I've heard of them, I've heard them, but I've never really known what they are. So could you tell us about how those are different from your traditional resonators?
Sure. The Basso Bravo resonators were developed after, let's see, it's sort of perfect we're in here. I'm going to move the setup here, and I'm going to show you another instrument in my office, and which is the archetype of what I use to develop the Basso Bravo resonator. So
awesome.
I'm going to pull this chair over here. All right, so you're going to have to tell me, can you see this little instrument on the floor here?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
Angled down a tiny bit.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
There we go. So this is for a while I went through a serious vibraphone phase, and so this is an instrument where these are essentially tuned marimba bars, but instead of using resonators as we're all accustomed to, I use gourds, and I tune the gourds to match the frequency of the bar, just like you tune a metal resonator. So this is the sound of this instrument here. So I'm not sure if you can really tell from this because the sound of the iPad here, but it's like this really killer warm. I'll put this back here. It's just a really nice warm dark bass sound, and and so I made a bunch of these instruments back in the 90s, and it always sat in my mind that how could a gourd sound so good? Because the inside of the gourd, it's pithy, it's not hard, it's the whole thing is really inconsistent, and it just sort of broke all the rules of how I thought a resonator could be made. So about 10 years after that, we started doing a bunch of experimentation of how to take my oval resonators and basically manipulate the harmonic spectrum inside of it to make it sound like the ballophone here. And generally speaking, the sound of the ballophone is, with the gourd resonators, it's a really warm, dark bass sound, ideal for bass notes. And so what that means, like for an instrument maker, is the fundamental frequency is turned up like on a graphic equalizer, and the overtones are turned down. So if you think of the sound of a bass note, sometimes you'll hear a bass note in a marimba, and it'll be like, sure, the bass note is there, but it's really bright. There's all sorts of overtones. I was trying to basically create a sound that was much darker and much warmer, and not have so many overtones. So for the Basso Bravo resonators, we set up we have like a soundproof room. We have a Wenger sound module, and that we temperature control. It's soundproof, and we have a lot of software that we've used over the years. And so we started analyzing our current resonators and basically quantifying what we heard musically was going on. And then we just started experimenting with resonators and using the exact same shape. And I guess if it's okay, I have this marimba right here that has Basso Bravo resonators. Should I show you right on it?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm gonna pull back some bars and boom. Okay. So are we there?
Yes.
Okay. And so I'm going to move these. So what you're seeing right now, is this a good angle?
Yeah.
Okay. So unlike the classic resonators that we developed in the 80s, you're looking here at the low C sharp and D sharp of a 5-octave marimba, and what we have over the top are these essentially plates or caps, and then going straight down the center of the resonator is another resonator. And so on the C sharp 2, on the C sharp 2 resonator, the low resonator, it goes down about 12 or 14 inches, and essentially what it does is we were able by here, I'll get back to this here. So what we were able to do is essentially attenuate those upper overtones and boost the bass end. And what we did is we played with the size of that other tube going straight down and the length. And by doing that, we could control the brightness and darkness of the resonator. And also what it does is the Basso Bravo resonators are a little bit louder as well than the classic resonators. And so in doing that process, we would always listen to everything really closely, and then we'd go back to our software and prove it to our ears what we were hearing. So a little bit like a sort of a biofeedback loop for us. So we'd play the marimba in the shop, and we'd say, okay, because it's the bottom 8 notes on the marimba that are the Basso Bravo notes, and we'd play them and say, maybe this, for example, the E was a little bit bright. So we'd listen in the shop, and then we'd go to the spectrum analysis and say, aha, yeah, the E was indeed bright. What was bright about it? Maybe it was a G sharp within that low E. So then we'd go and we'd re-engineer that particular resonator to get it to be a little bit darker. So what we did is we tried to not just get each note individually really warm sounding, but we worked really, really hard to get them all blended well together. So it basically just sounds musical, which is our whole goal.
So I had a quick question as a follow-up to that. The Basso Bravo, it exclusively deals with the re-engineering of the resonator. You didn't have to mess around with like the tuning of the keys at all?
That's correct.
Okay.
That is correct. It's only the resonator, nothing else. Yeah.
Wow, this whole business of like getting into building instruments it seems like so many different parts of your brain are working at the same time. Like you have to be very artistic and very creative, but also like kind of into physics.
Yeah, there's, I mean, the credit goes to a lot of people here at Marimba One, but that's definitely our approach. We first listen to it as musicians, and basically say, does it sound good? And I think, are there problems with this? And then we go to the analytical side and basically identify what it is we like and what it is we don't like and why we like it and why we don't like it. And then figure out ways how to engineer it out or reinforce it.
Well, and any of us, once we're lucky enough to own a marimba of whatever kind, something that we're not always so sure about is how to take care of it, to make sure that it always sounds good. And so to combine one of my questions, which is how often should you get your bars retuned?
Yeah.
So we'll start with that, and then we'll add to it a question from Peter Ferry from Facebook. Besides long-term maintenance, how can we make sure our marimbas are in peak condition and consistency the day of a concert or recording session?
Okay. So in terms of retuning, I recommend people, after they get the marimba, to have it retuned within 2 years. And just as an aside, we always give a free retuning for 2 years just for that reason. Because any new instrument you get is going to go a little bit sharp. And even though we have wood that's aged many, many years, it'll still go a little bit sharp. In particular, if you're in an area that's super dry. Like let's say we send a marimba to New Mexico, where the humidity is very low. Within 4 to 5 months, the instrument will go a little bit sharp. And the way it goes sharp, it doesn't go sharp uniformly. Some bars will go sharper than others, and also not the fundamentals won't necessarily all go sharp, but it may be some of the overtones that go sharp. And so what it is the whole thing just shifts a little bit out of alignment, and through retuning it, you could really get it sound much, much better. And it's pretty easy to retune, and you'd be surprised how little wood is removed, but how big a difference it can really make. So Peter Ferry's question about what you can do to have the instrument be optimal in a recording situation or a performance situation. So the first thing is make sure you have enough time for the instrument to acclimate. So ideally, what we do is we tune the resonators at 70 degrees and the bars at 70 degrees, plus or minus 3 or 4 degrees. And so that's its optimal playing temperature in that range. And so if, let's say, you just drove overnight from Chicago and it was super cold in your car, it'd be really good to let your instrument warm up for several hours. I think Peter Ferry lives in Chicago. And so that's just the very first thing. Make sure that it has time to come to ambient room temperature. And it could be, maybe 3 hours or so, or 4 hours if it was super cold. And then, let's see, the other thing, ideally, is if you could have some control over where the marimba is physically in the room that it's being either recorded in or performed in. Performance rooms probably have more space. Recording rooms a little bit tighter in space. And so that's really, those are the things. Temperature and finding a good spot in the room. You can't always find that. And But I think those are the two things that come to mind that are important.
I had a follow-up question to that. One of the weirdest gigs I've ever gotten, this is when I was a student in Miami. I played a recital, and there was this old lady that came up to me, and she said, "I'm having my 80th birthday party next month, and I love the sound of marimba, and I would love you to come play at my house." Which was very bizarre in and of itself, that I was playing for someone's birthday party that I didn't know. But it was outdoors in Miami, so it was super hot and muggy, and also I'm pretty sure, I can't recall, I might have been in at least partial sunlight or maybe even direct sunlight. Luckily it wasn't a very nice instrument that I took along with me, but the second that I played the first note, the sound went entirely dead. I noticed there was no resonance, which probably has to do with, I'm guessing, there was no air in the resonators. So in a situation like that where you're playing outdoors, which I know people do sometimes for weddings, is there anything you would recommend to at least make the marimba sound somewhat better than just sticking it outside?
Okay, so if it was really hot and humid, when it's warm, resonators will go out of tune, they'll go sharp. So let's say it was in the the 80s or 90s, those resonators went out of tune, so essentially the resonator was no longer tuned to that bar, so it's going to sound like almost like a marimba without resonators.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it sounded like. It was dead.
And then the high humidity, that's going to choke up the bars. That's like the biggest culprit for poor performing bars is humidity. So I mean, strategically, if she told you, okay, can you play at noon, you'd have that marimba set up at 5 to noon and under shade, so the instrument has as little time as possible to acclimate to the heat and the humidity. That would be the trick, really. But as you played, it would probably get worse.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was to the point where I was like almost trying to think of how to attach a bag of ice to the resonators or something. It was just not good.
And can that heat and humidity permanently damage the instrument?
Let's see,
after repeated exposure.
The humidity seems to be the worst. I've seen bars crack if it cycles a lot between humid and not humid, humid and not humid, and so and I believe that's the biggest culprit or the biggest danger for marimba bars. Going from if it cycles slowly, that's probably not a big deal, because as the wood's always going to be taking on moisture and giving off moisture. So you just want to keep it as stable as you can. But if you can't do that, you want it to cycle relatively slowly. Yeah. But when you think about it, a marimba bar, I'll grab a piece of wood here. Here's one. So a marimba bar, as a piece of wood goes, is pretty small. I mean, when you think about it, and so it's relatively stable. So it's hard to hurt them. They're pretty durable, but in high humidity situations, that's when they'll suffer the most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just think about these DCI groups that are using rosewood marimbas in the direct sunlight, and I think we're much more aware of it than we were 10 years ago. And this summer, when I saw a couple groups rehearsing, I saw them, putting covers on the marimba every single time they weren't playing them, which is great, but they're still in direct sunlight. Yeah. And I just think that's an irresponsible use of rosewood.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you, because it'd be like taking a really nice violin outside in the blazing sun and all the time. Yeah, it's really hard on the instruments.
Yeah, I don't think it's good.
Yeah, not for me. Well, speaking of rosewood, I know a topic that we really wanted to talk to you about today, that we have Facebook questions about, and that Ben has prepared, is all about rosewood and the state of it today. So, Ben, can you fill us in on what's going on with rosewood?
Sure. So, if you go online to look at information about this, as I did, it can be very confusing, because a lot of it has to do with international trade regulations, and there's technical jargon that goes with that. But I tried to sort of sum it up into a brief summary, and I know Ron is an expert on this, so I'd love to hear him talk about it too. But anyway, rosewood is the name of several different species of darkly colored wood, and as we talked about before one time, it's actually named for the rosy, sweet smell when you cut it, not the color of the wood, so not all rosewood is necessarily super reddish in color. It's used in musical instruments, including guitars, banjos, mandolins, harp bodies, violin fingerboards, marimbas, recorders, and clarinets, as well as in other uses such as furniture, cabinets, luxury flooring, and small woodwork pieces like chess sets, fountain pens, etc. The group that deals with the sort of trade of these exotic wood species is called CITES, CITES, which stands for Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And they're the ones that have the website that, like I said, has all sorts of like technical jargon on this stuff. So as far as the rosewood used in marimbas, we use Honduran rosewood, also called Honduras rosewood at times. And so Honduran rosewood grows in the broadleaf evergreen swamp forests of southern Belize and nearby regions of Guatemala and Mexico. You can tell these were not my words. These were directly from sites. And from my understanding, it seems that actually Honduran rosewood is the sort of, for lack of a better word, brand of rosewood or species of rosewood. Most of it actually doesn't seem to grow in Honduras, which seemed odd to me, and it seems there is some growing in Honduras, but it's largely protected. So anyway, I wanted to read a little quote from a site's thing that I read. It said, "It is of limited availability in trade, although it is very much sought after, particularly as a tone wood for musical instruments, and increasingly by the Asian market for furniture and cabinet making. The species is not available from plantations and therefore must be sourced from wild populations. In spite of its rarity, there is a high level of wastage, as up to 80% is wasted, as only logs of the straightest grain are used to make marimba bars. Large volumes are also lost when the low-value sapwood is removed. Increased accessibility to its habitat and declining stocks of other rosewoods has almost certainly led to the growing pressure to turn this species to meet demand." And I know on Gordon Stout's episode, he spoke briefly about, he said he had heard something from Ron and he wasn't quite sure what it was, but he had heard something about the brother of the president of Belize was involved as the main illegal exporter of rosewood to China. And so I did some more research on China and rosewood, and apparently in Chinese culture, rosewood is revered as some sort of beautiful material, which it is. And so in a lot of sort of imperial ancient Chinese art, you see rosewood cabinets and rosewood wardrobes and this sort of thing. And I was reading about it. It's interesting. If you know anything about the economics of China, China is experiencing an explosion of sort of the high middle class. And now people in China the masses are able to afford cars. And so there's all sorts of new roads in China. And this is why Beijing is exploding. But also, this means that a lot more people of this gigantic Chinese population are able to afford rosewood, and they are buying it faster than it can be legally procured. So there are all sorts of terrible sort of illegal rosewood operations, and we've heard of blood diamonds. There's also blood wood, which comes from conflict areas in Thailand, and what was the other country on the video that Casey sent us? I can't remember, but Eastern Asian.
Cambodia.
Yeah, Cambodia is also another just huge, terrible rosewood poaching situation. And so in 2013, there was a CITES Conference of the Parties, the 16th CITES Conference of the Parties in Bangkok, Thailand, and they put all rosewood, including Honduran rosewood used in marimbas, they listed it as CITES Appendix 2 status, with the exception of Brazilian rosewood, which was already listed as CITES Appendix 1, which is the next level, which basically means that they're putting trade restrictions on it to try to prevent extinction. So it is endangered, but not extinct yet by any means, and they're trying to protect it. There are also regulations on how much of it you can ship. In 2008, at the 23rd CITES meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, they put a limit of 10 kilograms, which is 22 pounds limit per shipment, which was discussed as potentially problematic, especially for traveling musical ensembles, where the entire musical instrument population would obviously be much over 22 pounds. So it sounds like in 2016, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service clarified this to mean 10 kilograms or 22 pounds per instrument. And I know I heard Gordon talk one time about Doug DeMauro was having trouble trying to ship an instrument to Africa because his bars weighed over, I suppose, this 22-pound limit. And speaking of Gordon's stout, he has recently premiered a piece called One Last Breath, which is sort of a tribute to rosewood and its hopefully not, but possibly stages of extinction. So yeah, there's all sorts of information. Like I said, it's very difficult to sift through because it's not super music related all the time. But Ron, I know you deal extensively with this. Could you tell us about your dealings with it, and especially this weird situation that Gordon mentioned about Belize?
Yeah, the Belize, the Prime Minister's brother for a period of time was the largest exporter of rosewood out of Belize, and that rosewood was all going to China. And so you could make whatever conclusions you want from that. And by the way, Honduras rosewood, it's called Honduras rosewood because Belize used to be British Honduras.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
When Deegan first using rosewood, when Deegan first started using rosewood, it was British Honduras, and then in the 70s became Belize. But the name of the wood stuck as Honduran rosewood. And Honduran rosewood grows, like you said, in Belize and Guatemala, a little bit in southern Mexico, but it does not grow in Honduras. It's just those three countries. And it's been illegal to cut in Mexico since the 90s. And so all the rosewood that's legally cut right now comes from Belize and Guatemala. And here, everything you said, I think is pretty much true. And here's how we've dealt with that. When we learned that CITES was raising the level of regulation on rosewood, basically we knew we had to go into action. And just for general layman's terms, up until the raising of the flag happened, it went into effect on January 2nd, 2017. Before that, all the rosewoods, other than, like you said, Brazilian rosewood, were, I know Honduras rosewood was on CITES 3. I don't know if all the other rosewoods were. But for Honduras rosewood being on CITES 3, what that meant, it meant that there's still no regulations, but it was a watch list. And it meant that the international community believed that there's going to be some problems there because of rapid deforestation, illegal poaching, illegal export and import. And
Ron, sorry, if I could just interject, one thing that, because we're talking to you, I wanted to clarify is that there was actually a CITES report where they talked about the musical uses of rosewood, and basically they said musicians have only the greatest interest of rosewood at heart, and also the amount of rosewood that musicians are using is an almost insignificant portion in relation to the abuses of illegal rosewood for furniture and so on. So I just wanted to put it out there that Ron's use of rosewood is considered ethical and responsible compared to the sort of terrible illegal trade that's happening related to furniture. But sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to put that out there while you were talking.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's really true. The furniture industry in China is really big, and compared to what all musical instrument makers use, we're a small portion of that. And so like you said, when China became more and more prosperous, all the rosewoods from Central America, South America, Africa, Madagascar, Asia, they all started going to China for the furniture industry, exactly like you said. And so a lot of companies felt like CITES acted too quickly in elevating the status from the watch list, CITES 3, to highly regulated CITES 2. And I personally feel that it was a great thing and that it was long overdue, because you could argue that, let's study this for another 5 years and make sure we're making the best decision. In that period of time, more and more forests would be decimated. And we had to act. Everybody knew what was going on. And what got me involved in rosewood was certainly marimbas. And around around 2008, as I saw my U.S. suppliers, their ability to get rosewood starting to dry up, I realized I had to go down to Central America and figure out how to get the wood directly down there. And it was it took just countless trips going down to Central America to set up a supply chain of rosewood and meeting with all sorts of people and never getting I would say never really getting ripped off, but everything just a little not really knowing if it's going to work out, because essentially I'm sending money down to Central America to people I don't really know to mill wood for me. And so the way I figured I could make that work was I would go down there frequently. Every piece of wood we ever bought, we individually inspected. So if we got a container load of wood, every stick of wood, which would be about 15,000 pieces of wood, we'd individually inspect and look over. And eventually what we did is we sent a mill down to a family in Belize because they couldn't afford to really upgrade their from a table saw, literally. So they would get the logs. They'd get the logs. They'd be stamped from forestry, and then they, with a chainsaw, they'd cut them in half and they'd put them on a table saw in a little shed covered in thatch and start milling out the wood. And it would take forever for us to get a load of rosewood. So I sent down a mobile dimension band sawmill and something very low tech because the jungle down there eats everything up. And about 100 extra bandsaw blades, sent down a whole sharpening setup, because up until that time, they would have to travel 5 hours each direction just to get one blade resharpened. And so once we set up this family with a mill, they were able to mill the wood much more efficiently. And it would take about a year to get a load of rosewood, a long time. And just sort of a funny story is in the early days of that relationship, whenever something really wasn't going right, and I just had to more or less use my intuition to figure it out, because you couldn't really know from the conversation what was really happening, I would just get on a plane and go down there. And so what the fellow told me, who I gave the mill to, I ended up trading him for rosewood, is that I said, well, why are things slowing down here so much? Why is it taking so long? Just explain this to me so I understand. And he said in the Mayan language, their Mayan language, Quechua, they have no word for future. And so he said they're afraid if they ever finish this order, I would never place another order. And so that sounds like a sort of a cultural, bridge I had to figure out how to cross. So what I told him, I said, okay, well, what I'll do is I promise you every time that you complete an order, I'll send you another deposit for another order. And so that's sort of what got the whole thing going, along with sending the mill down. And so what's happened, so my rosewood comes from both Belize and Guatemala. And the Belize rosewood, over time, there's been, as the controversy in Central America has risen over rosewood, there's been more and more regulations put on the cutting of the wood. So our most recent order of rosewood, that wood came from a large tract of land that foresters cut it up into 30 imaginary individual tracts. And then what they did is we got to bid on it. So my supplier down there and myself, we bought all the rosewood off that first tract of land. And the way it worked was they were allowed, they could cut any trees that were 10 inches and bigger. And so it's called selectively cut. And so all the trees below 10 inches, they left. And then the next year, they'd go on to the second tract of land. So it'd be a 30-year cycle. And in that 30 years, they believed that the forest would regenerate in that period of time. And so that's how it worked for us in Belize. And in Guatemala, for that rosewood, the government requires them to plant 14 rosewood trees for every rosewood tree that's cut. And so my supplier down there, he has he has a whole nursery, somewhat of a, with thousands and thousands of rosewood trees. And the rosewood tree, it's in the legume family, which is a nitrogen fixing tree. And so what they'll do at the right time of year, they'll go around and they'll collect the seed pods that fall on the ground, and they'll crack them open. It's like a little paper, like a stiff, almost leather-like paper that surrounds the seed. So they'll open that up to give the seed a better chance of sprouting, and they'll plant them, and then they'll go ahead and when they're big enough, they'll just plant them back in the forest. That's how that situation works there. Yeah. But in reality, both Belize and Guatemala, it's very highly regulated right now. Is people are generally fairly poor there, and there's a lot of motivation for people to poach the logs. Because if someone comes in and say, "Hey, I'm going to give you cash right now for these trees," it's really tempting. And so what CITES has done, CITES has required that literally from forest to factory, you have to have chain of custody, everything. Like you have to have proof of forestry approval in either Belize or Guatemala. You have to document the transportation. You can't just have a truckload of rosewood show up at the border. Everything has to be methodically documented, and that's sort of, I think, a great thing about CITES is that everything is now highly regulated, and it's much more difficult to poach wood like it's never been before. Also, just a little aside is that of all the CITES regulates all sorts of endangered species around the whole world, and rosewood, it's the highest value illegally traded endangered species there is on the planet.
Wow!
Oh my goodness!
Wow!
Yeah. I read that I think on the CITES site, and
yeah. And it's interesting also with all especially the China stuff. It seems sort of like gold and diamonds, where because it is a precious material, that makes it more desirable, which then even drives up the demand more. It's sort of like a snowball effect problem.
It's self-feeding.
Yeah.
It is it brings in speculators. People who want to hoard it. Yeah,
also like this process. Casey sent us this video that National Geographic did about rosewood poaching in Cambodia and Thailand, as Ben mentioned, and it's crazy that they can't catch these guys because they're chopping down trees. They're not just digging for gold. I mean,
and the poachers were
like
also
they're cutting down trees that makes noise, and they're large.
The poachers were
so
also taunting the rangers that were going after them. They were stamping their initials on things just to screw around with the range. It was insane. We needed to link that video somehow on here.
Yeah, it's really cool. But I mean, also, forests are giant places. So, and I could see it, but it seems like it'd be easier to catch than people who are, I guess, killing elephants for tusks and ivory and things like that.
I mean, it's hard. It's hard because a lot of these areas are remote, and there's not many people around. And so these areas of Belize and Guatemala, there's there's settlements there, there's people there, but still it's remote, and it's really hard to police and manage it all. And so that's why CITES came down and said you have to prove everything from forest to factory, that the entire way that it's all legal, and that's their effort to really attempt to make everything on the up and up.
We have family members that have a beautiful rosewood table and set of chairs that sits outside on their porch. Uh-huh. And when they told us it was rosewood, and it was my first time there, I had this like, what? But it's correct to say that the parts of the tree that we want for marimba bars are the very center. Is that right?
No, actually not. Yeah. So when I don't know why this occurs, but every rosewood tree, if you look at the end of the log where it's cut, without exception, there's always rot in there, and particularly more at the base of the tree. But even as you go up the tree, there's a little bit of rot, and there's always cracks radiating out from the center of the tree. So what's really kept rosewood around as long as it's been around is that the tree, the Honduras rosewood, is that the tree itself has a lot of defect in the tree. It's not like a tree that you could take and put on a mill and just saw boards off the tree. With rosewood, there's in the center in particular, there's always cracks and rot, so you always have to cut around it and spend a lot of time. So the wood that's usable, that doesn't have the cracks, will be away from the center, and also it won't be the very outside of the tree, because the outside of the tree has a little bit of like ivory-colored bark. You may have seen some marimba bars that have a little bit of ivory color to them, and that's the sapwood. And so ultimately you have the wood that's just in from the sapwood and as far towards the center as you can get without having any cracks. That's really what's usable on that tree.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
So changing gears a bit, we had a Facebook question from Brian Calhoun, and I wanted to ask Brian's question, but also sort of a more general question. Brian said, would you consider making a 4-octave marimba? The lower 4 octaves I rarely play up there, but also I just wanted to ask about some of the more interesting custom instruments you've been asked to make, and if there's been anything you felt you couldn't make. For example, I know that Ijin Fang has a Marimba One with piano-colored keys, like the naturals are light-colored and the accidentals are dark-colored, and I've seen Marimba Ones that split halfway so they can fit through doors and things like that. So could you tell us about some of the more bizarre requests you've had?
We get requests maybe once a year or so for instruments like Ijin Fang's marimba, where she wanted to look like a piano, and the rosewood comes in all different colors, and we don't stain our rosewood. And I've always believed the rosewood is so beautiful that I could never bring myself to stain it. I thought the color was just beautiful as it is. And the rosewood from Guatemala generally tends to be dark. The rosewood from Belize can go from very light to dark. So for Ijin Fang's marimba, we used for the naturals, it would have been rosewood definitely from Belize for the lighter part, for the white keys. And then for the black keys, it would have been either Guatemala rosewood or dark Belize rosewood. So I mean, we can certainly do that. When we build marimbas, people can always ask us for things like that because we have a lot of rosewood, and it's easy for us to do it. It makes it more interesting for the crew who's building the marimbas, because then they get to do something that's fun and a little bit different. So the marimbas that split in half, those are engineering nightmares. We prefer not to make those. Made one, for schools that have old elevators that are small elevators and they're trying to move around a marimba between floors, so that without always taking it apart. So that's what precipitated that. Let me think. Let's see. Acoustically on the instruments, all the things that we're doing now came out of people's requests. So we were talking about the resonators, the original classic resonators versus the Basso Bravo resonators. That actually came out of, along with my ballophone here in my office. People would tell me, gosh, can you, I think I'd like a marimba that sounds a little bit darker. So that kind of request. For the keyboards, you probably already know we have different levels of keyboards, and that's traditional, enhanced, and premium. And we don't put any more time into tuning those particular keyboards. It's that we're looking to optimize the potential of each piece of wood, and so I think in a way those are probably, at least to my way of thinking, the most meaningful things we can do for people is build these different acoustics of instruments. And there's one sort of esoteric topic that's a little bit hard to articulate. Let me know if you have questions about this. Is that the rosewood from Belize and Guatemala is the same the same rosewood, the same trees that all the marimba companies are using. And we just happen to go directly to the source. I think we're the only company that are doing that in both Guatemala and Belize. And I wanted to do that so I wouldn't be competing with the other marimba companies for the same wood, essentially.
Right.
And wanted to have first pick. When you're, and so other companies definitely have access to high quality rosewood too. And the difference in the qualitative differences in the sounds of the instruments that you hear around the world are a function of certainly the rosewood that's used, but also the tuning. And so it's a little bit like you could plan to make a really great dinner, like the best dinner you could imagine, and get the best ingredients. But if you burn it, you still may have had the best ingredients, but it's not going to taste very good. So with marimba bars and tuning, we always, like, I've never put a time frame on anybody to tune a single marimba bar who works for me. It's always we're trying to optimize that piece of wood. So you can take a really great piece of wood, but if you don't tune it correctly or tune it well, it'll just be an average sounding marimba bar. And so if you conversely, if you really know how to tune a bar very well and you take the time to do it, it could come out really good. And the job of a tuner, in my mind, the real job of a marimba tuner is they're a problem solver. That's what they're doing. They're problem solvers. Sure, they happen to be tuning, but as you tune, you're identifying all these different things that are oftentimes conflicting with each other, and you have to resolve those. And when you do that well, that's when it sounds most musical. So back to what people ask us to do. I mean, essentially, of the weird things, people ask us to make crazy colored resonators sometimes. You may have seen some of those instruments.
There's one instrument that I've always wanted, and that is Dan Levitan's Marimba Quartet requires an extra low A and B flat underneath the conventional 5-octave range. So I've always wanted a 2-note marimba that I could just wheel up.
Well, that would be, it might tip over. You'd have to put some big
It would be interesting.
I would love to hear anything about the vibraphone that you've released recently, if you feel okay talking about that.
Totally, yeah. So we spent about a little over 2 years, thought about it for a long time, but once we committed, we spent over 2 years designing a vibraphone, and it ended up being a much more challenging project than I thought and anybody else here thought it was going to be. And what we did is we knew we wanted to, like the marimbas, design it from the ground up, everything. And so over the years, I collected a number of vibraphones. I had a really nice old Musser from the 70s with a killer sound that legend has it is that Gary Burton had selected those bars out for that particular instrument. And then I had a newer Musser, a Yamaha, and some other instruments. And I set them all up in my shop. And when people would come through, I'd ask them to play, and everybody universally gravitated towards that old Musser. And they all loved the sound on that old instrument. It was really warm and resonant, a very beautiful sound. And then in the meantime, we set about trying to understanding how we could build a better instrument. And so we included like the easy height adjustment system on the vibraphone, so it's easy to height adjust. On all the shapes on the vibraphone, all the metal shapes on it, those are our own extrusions. Those are our own proprietary shapes that we thought would work best for the instrument. We make everything here. Now it's not like subbed out overseas. It's done 100% here. One thing we did is we analyzed all the aluminum from all the different marimba companies to really understand what was going on. And we actually decided on an alloy mix that was a little bit different than everybody else's that we liked, that we felt was warmer and more resonant. So that's what we chose. And I think sometimes in this industry, there's not a lot of, it's not often that you find companies that are doing primary research. It's more of a derivative approach where they'll say, okay, this company used this, we're just going to use this because it's worked for them. And so we like going back to the very beginning and trying to ask the questions, well, why was this exact alloy used? And are there other ones that maybe we like better? It turns out there are. And then we had to set up a whole area of the shop for metalworking. Megan, when you came through here, that was all set up, I believe.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, something that I really took away, or something I wasn't expecting when I came to visit Marimba One, was that it felt less of a factory and it felt more like an invention lab.
I see.
I mean, like everything's being made there, and there's a specific order and everything's happening in this amazing way, but also all the experiments that are happening. And so, yes, that was set up when I was there. That was really cool.
Yeah. And that was a super long process, just getting all the metalworking tools organized to do what we want them to do.
And metal's different than wood.
Yes. And there were some things that we wanted to solve, and it was like the marimbas in that I would have conversations with people. Different people here would also have conversations with vibe players, and we try to understand what were some of the problems that people had and that they wanted to see resolved. And so one of them was the damping pad, sort of the classic damping pad, not equally damping the bars, and so we invented a little hard to describe, but there's a traditional tensioner on the pad, and so one thing about the damping pad is like the theory is that the bottoms of all the 5 bars, naturals and accidentals, have to be in exactly the same plane, like dead on the same plane. And what that means is that the holes in the bars have to be drilled very perfectly down up from the bottom of the bar, so that the bottoms are in the same plane. And then also the pad that the felt pad that rests on the piece of aluminum. We use aluminum for that. That too has to be like totally dead flat, so that if it's warped or something or twisted, of course it's not going to touch the bars at the same moment. And so we dealt with all that, but also what we did on the bass end of the instrument, we devised a little box that you could essentially lower just the bass end of the damping pad or raise it up a little bit. So the bass bars have more energy to them because they're bigger. They'll ring longer. When you strike them with the same strike force as, for example, the top bars. So you can play with that. So you can say, okay, I want the bass end to ring out a little bit longer because maybe you're comping in a jazz piece, chords in the bass end, or else you want it to ring the exact same as the rest of the instrument. So just a little knob, you could control that the ring time of the bars. And then the other thing we spend a lot of time on is the drive system for the fans. Mm-hmm. And what we ended up developing is a system where it's a little bit hard to describe, but we have a motor, and variable speed motor. And by the way, when you stop the motor, the fans always stop at the 12 o'clock position, both of them.
What?
Well done.
What? Finally.
So there's these 2 discs that spin around, and the discs, they have embedded in them rare earth magnets. And about a quarter inch away from them is another disc with a rare earth magnet embedded in those as well. And that secondary disc is attached to the shaft that has all the fans that spin around inside the resonators. Mm-hmm. So basically, there's no mechanical contact between these rotating discs. And so what it allows us to do basically is it keeps the system really quiet, which is super important. But also when you go to set the vibe up or take it down, you don't have to deal with the belt or anything. You just put the resonators in or take them out. The belt, you never unhook the belt or have to hook the belt up. And so it just makes it really easy. And yeah, just trying to figure out how to simplify the instrument is what our big goal has been.
I had a question about vibraphones, and when you think about xylophones, everyone always says, "Oh, the old Deegan xylophones sound so good," and that makes sense to me because it's the old wood, etc., etc., etc. For vibraphones, it's always, "Oh, those Musser vibraphones from the '70s sound so good," and the Marimba One vibe sounds a lot like the old Musser vibes to me. But what is why do the '70s Musser vibes sound better than new Musser vibe? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me because it's metal. It shouldn't be changing unless they change their alloy to something worse.
So we posed that question we have some friends who are material scientists, and that exact question, and we actually sent them some bars for them to analyze as well from the early '70s vibe that I mentioned, and actually the newer Musser vibe, which are the same alloy. Those two proved out to be the same alloy, and so essentially what the material scientists told us is that the crystalline structure changes inside that metal over time, and it essentially changed. So what we hear a bit of a change in like the harmonic structure. The fundamental becomes a little bit stronger, and the overtones become a little bit weaker. The only downside of it is that it doesn't ring quite as long, the old Musser, but which didn't seem like a big deal because, like I said, when everybody came through the shop, 100% everybody loved that old Musser, and so but that's apparently something actually changes within the metal itself. And
that makes sense because that's what happens with cymbals. That's why cymbals change, right? Same concept.
Yeah, and the same with rosewood bars too. So when we get a marimba back to retune, we can tell, we can generally tell how that instrument was played because we keep records on the instruments. We know what we sent out to people, and so we've received instruments back that sound literally confused, and go, God, this is like not a very good keyboard. And I'll call the teacher up and say, hey, what's going on? And this exact situation happened, and it was at a school. And they said, well, basically anybody can have at that marimba anytime, anywhere, and there's no controls over it. And at the same time, we got Katerina Mishka's keyboard back here to retune, and that thing sounded phenomenal. It sounded better than when we sent it out to her. And so like a good musician's going to develop their keyboard, they're going to play it, and they're basically going to play it to sound in its most musical way possible. And it sounds like magic, but it really sort of is. That basically develops the instrument. It's like a violin. People could, like a really great violin, someone could say, hey, I could tell someone played my violin. You know, you can just feel it. And it's the same with marimbas and the same with vibes and cymbals. It really makes a difference.
Yeah.
So, Ron, I wanted to ask you about something, and I feel like an old man when I say this, because I can say, I remember when Marimba One only made instruments. And
Me too.
I distinctly remember in undergrad when you guys started making mallets, and it's like, no, they can't make mallets, they only make marimbas. So could you tell us about first of all, what was your inspiration behind starting to make a completely different product in mallets? Because I guess that was your first venture out from the instruments themselves. And then what was the development process like for those?
Yeah, it was super interesting and really fun, I gotta say. Let's see, what drove that process, it's been a while now, it's been probably 10 years or so. What drove that process was some musicians with whom I worked asked me to do that. And you know, I hemmed and hawed over it and finally said, okay, we'll start to figure this out. And so what we have a habit of sort of doing everything from the ground up. So what we did is we make all our own heads. I think we're the only company that makes all their own heads. Like, we designed them all up, and we have a system where we have 3 different head sizes, and they're injection molded, which is a way of injection molding. We use these materials that are a cross between rubbers and plastic. They're called thermoelastomers.
Are you talking about, when you're talking about heads, are you talking about the cores of the mallets?
Cores,
okay.
Yeah. And so you can make them we have 3 different sizes. We have all different hardnesses we can make them. And then we also encapsulate weights, if we choose, in there to make them like, for example, the Catarina musica mallets are like really heavy, whereas the round sound are very light. So we can make them different weights as well. So there's a whole, like, we created a whole sort of large palette of possibilities for us. And then we actually developed and patented this really cool machine that what it does is we glue the head on the shaft, whether it be rattan or birch, and we put it in a chuck, like a drill press chuck that's vertically oriented and slowly revolves around. And then we have these these hollow tubes where the yarn spools out. And what we patented is that we have two independent yarns being wrapped at once. So we could either do like wool and wool, synthetic and wool, or synthetic and synthetic. And also we can control the angle with which it wraps as well. And by controlling the angle, that allows you to mass the yarn in different areas of the head. So, for example, let's see, the wave wrap mallets, there's more yarn around the equator of it. And so that gives you a different sound. Also, we put digital tensioners on it, so it's constantly measuring tension. It's not just like, you just don't dial the tension on it. It's like in real time, always correctly tensioning it. So we got really into the mechanical side of it, as you could tell. And then once we started making mallets, we sent them out to a lot of different musicians and tried to really learn from them of what was, what people really wanted. Mm-hmm. And so the first ones that came out were the double helix mallets, which are still our most popular series. And a big shout out to Yuko Yoshikawa, who helped us out quite a bit on those. And it was just a really, really interesting learning process. What it did for me, and I think everybody here, it allowed us to learn a lot about our marimbas through the mallets. I mean, that's really what came out for us. And I don't know, it's just been a really sort of fun, interesting process of making mallets. And again, they're not easy, they're a challenge. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Ben?
Yeah. And I mean, to me, like, I won't name manufacturers, but sometimes, like, you get a mallet and you look at it and okay, here's a marimba mallet. You can kind of toss it aside. Those double helix mallets, I remember when I first saw them, I was like, I have to hold this and look at it. They just look so cool and so impressive to look at, and now I can understand why with all the engineering that went into them.
Yeah, and I gotta give credit to a fellow named Steve Cole. Megan, you may have met Steve. He's the handlebar mustache character.
Oh, I did.
He's here.
Yeah.
On Basic Show. So Steve is the lead engineer here.
Yeah.
And so Steve invented that machine, and also he's the lead engineer, like all the cool hardware on the Izzy, on the 3100. That's all. I mean, Steve and I will work together on concepts, but Steve is like, he's the hardcore engineer, really designing up all those unique parts and all those systems, the height adjustment systems, all that. So yeah, some great people here, really great people here.
Yeah. Well, guys, this has been the quickest 75 minutes of discussion ever. Thanks, Ron, for all your energy and developing things that have helped Percussion World so much. Thanks to everybody for your Facebook questions, including those we didn't get to, from Brian Calhoun, Dan Chisholm, Maria Ineshlibis, and Alan Lang. And of course, thank you, Mr. Ron Samuels, for being able to spend some time with us and share your expertise.
Thank you all very much for your time.
Thanks, Ron.